Hello, and welcome to My Book, a podcast on books and their authors, produced by Cine Ink, based in London. I'm Loveleen Kacker. Today we are going to talk to Sam Miller, author of Migrants, The Story of Us All, published by Abacus books.
I think there is a clear human propensity to almost divide up the world, to say, I belong to this group and you belong to that group. And we've done it in lots of different ways over the centuries. It's only relatively recently, for instance, that we began to do it on the basis of colour. It was more likely to be on the basis of language, of culture, of values more generally. That was something the Greeks and the Romans, for instance, felt very strongly. It may be shared belief in particular God. There are a whole range of overlapping identities that we all might have. When I worry is that when one group becomes the most important, that being Indian almost defines you totally, or being British, or being a particular religion becomes your completely subsuming identity. That, I do think, is a danger, and it's certainly increased. And it's increased specifically with the growth of the nation state.
Sam Miller, author of Migrants, The Story of Us All. Thank you, Sam, for being with us today.
My pleasure. Very happy to be here.
So, Sam, I would just like to start by setting the tone of your book for our listeners. From what I understand, your book essentially says that human beings are migratory species and that they have the capability of settling almost anywhere, whereas being sedentary is actually an aberration. To quote from your book, history books are written by sedentary people for sedentary people. I would like to come to the current context. The world as we know it is still moving, from what I understand. People are moving from one part of the country to the other. It could be voluntary, like in the case of India, where you have this massive diaspora, people are moving, or it could be forced, or however else you might like to describe it, from countries like Afghanistan, Yemen, Pakistan, Syria, Turkey, or even countries like Albania, Ukraine. So why do you think that the migration question has become so mired in controversy now, considering that migration is still shaping our world?
That's a very good question, and it's a broad one. I think what's happened is that people want to cling on to what they have. There's almost a modern anxiety about losing what they have. And that could include property, it could include a particular nationality. I think from the 19th century, there's been also almost a sentimentalization of the idea of home. One has to have a place which one belongs to and is one's permanent place. And I'm in a way pointing out that that's very new. If you go back in human history, it's only really very recently that people have felt so strongly about this idea of home. And home as a place that includes people like you and excludes people who are unlike you.
Like the othering of people.
The othering of people, exactly. What we've also seen over the last 100 years is the proliferation of borders, and borders as fixed lines to cross which you need a particular passport and a visa. We think of those as fixed permanent things about our modern world, and they are in many ways, but they are very recent. And in my view, they're recent human constructions, and we need to remember that in the heart of our debates about migration today.
I understand, Sam, and I totally get what you say about passports and visas being barely 100 years old after the First World War. But nevertheless, this whole debate has become so increasingly toxic. The question is, how can you continue to say that humans even today are migratory if we are so very vicious in the way we are treating other people?
Well, I think you're right. There is a lot of viciousness around in the world. What I would point out is that we haven't seen anything yet. The likelihood of mass migrations on a scale we haven't seen in modern times because of climate change is huge.
Water, I would agree. Water is going to become a very big issue.
Absolutely. And the kind of agricultural setup of the world is going to change out of all recognition. We're going to see very significant movements of population, and we need to prepare for that. Otherwise, we're all going to be killing each other.
I pick up what you said. We are going to be killing each other. Where do you think we are going, and how can we deal with this? Because this othering of people, I mean, I'm just referring back to your chapter on the slave trade in Columbus and what happened there, and how a bunch of people came from Europe, killed a bunch of people, and then brought in a bunch of people from a third continent, and the whole convoluted question of color and forced migration and lack of choice kind of thing came in, and we till today are facing the backlash of it. There have been endless incidents of bad treatment of the blacks in America, for example, for the black people. So what will happen? Will we end up killing each other?
I think when I look at the current situation of the world and just look at it within the immediate context, I do feel quite pessimistic. I think the world is in a bad way, and its attitude to migration is a signal of that. All I would say is that I think I detect in generations younger than ours, people who are in their teens and 20s, a different attitude. Whether that continues as they grow older, let us see. But I think what is particularly and peculiarly lacking from older generations is a willingness almost to imagine the lives of people who aren't like us. In a sense, empathise with what they're going through. There are lots of good exceptions to that, of course, people who do empathise. And I think it's something that stands out among younger generations, that there is an interest and a caring towards people whose life experiences are very different, rather than just an obsession with people who are like them.
Well, good luck to that thought process, because as a migrant myself, I do worry about this fundamental question of whether anybody who looks different comes to a country and then is face situations where they realize that suddenly they have become a minority and that they stand out in a crowd where others look different. Having said that, there is another premise that you are making in your book, which I thought it would be good that we should talk about. And that is this whole question of being sedentary. Now, the word sedentary carries some negative connotations. You'll agree with that. Now, what you're suggesting is that being adventurous and having the curiosity gene is a positive thing, and being sedentary is a negative thing, if I can say that.
I don't go quite that far. What I am saying is that I feel myself that I'm non-sedentary.
Right, I get it.
And that a lot of people are sedentary, and good for them. But what they need to do is remember that so much of human history has been on the move and nomadic, and it's what in the end distinguishes us from almost every other species.
Except the rats.
Except the rats. So our closest cousins, our ape cousins in Africa, have never left.
They have never left. While you're right that if migration hadn't happened, the world wouldn't have been populated and all the rest of it. But if sedentary lives hadn't happened, if people hadn't settled by the rivers and created the river cities and then gone on, would life as we know have happened? Would discoveries have happened? Would inventions have happened? Would poetry, art, literature, would all that have happened? I mean, is it fair to totally discount settled life as sedentary? That's my basic question.
No, and I hope I don't. I certainly don't intend to do that.
Right.
What we often forget is it's the people who move between them who are the carriers of the geniuses of them. That they're often, yes, great things happen in the cities of Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium BC.
Right.
But actually what's more interesting is how that relates to what happens in Egypt, in China, in India.
Question here was that if we look at the percentage of migrants as the country's population, or any country, it's fairly minimalistic. So in terms of, my basic premise really is that of discounting entirely the sedentary lifestyle, which I think...
Well, I'm saying I don't. I also have a very deliberately broad definition of migrant.
Right.
So someone who moves from Chennai to Delhi is a migrant.
Of course.
Yeah?
Of course.
Someone who moves from Edinburgh to London is a migrant. In a way, it's not necessarily about borders, and it's not necessarily about countries. It's about people who, in a way, because they move, have to adapt their lifestyles, who have to behave in different ways because of their movement. And I've been surrounded by people all my life who are sedentary. My parents were very sedentary in their outlook, and good for them, and it made them happy. And I can think of lots of other people. However, in my wanderings, I think probably a minority of people who I'll have a conversation with, and we'll begin to talk about what we want to do in our lives and where we want to be. And there's almost a kind of, yes, I feel like that too. We want to go and explore places we haven't been to. We want to be on the move. And I'm not at all saying that's a better way of life. I am saying it's perhaps an older way of life, something that we all used to do, whether we liked it or not, and that a very significant number of us, probably still a minority, would love to do.
Yeah, and good luck to that, because I would love to travel if I could, but unfortunately I don't think I have the means to travel as much as I would like to. A third issue that sort of comes to my mind, and I think our listeners would be interested in, is in this whole question of racial purity, for example. Now, we have seen this as part of the border syndrome and othering, where we tend to think that there is a certain a racial purity. We are Anglo-Saxons, or we are Aryans, or we are XYZ, or we belong to a certain race, and therefore there is a kind of a cohesion and a unity, and we need to preserve this. I hear you talking about Parsis, for example. So what I'm trying to say is this: what do you think about racial purity in this current scenario? Is it just a bogey that is raised by politicians to serve their ends, which does seem to be there? Or the other thing is, I think the question of racial purity is also time limited. If city life is to be counted from X period, then I think the question of racial purity also probably started from there.
I think there is a clear human propensity to almost divide up the world, to say, I belong to this group and you belong to that group. And we've done it in lots of different ways over the centuries. It's only relatively recently, for instance, that we began to do it on the basis of colour. It was more likely to be on the basis of language, of culture, of values more generally. That was something the Greeks and the Romans, for instance, felt very strongly. It may be shared belief in particular God. There are a whole range of overlapping identities that we all might have. That, in our lives we might be, keen football supporters, or Indians, or Hindus, or writers, and you belong to all of these different overlapping groups. When I worry is that when one group becomes the most important, that being Indian almost defines you totally, or being British, or being a particular religion becomes your completely subsuming identity. That, I do think, is a danger, and it's certainly increased. And it's increased specifically with the growth of the nation state. Countries that are supposed to be for a certain community. So that Hungary for Hungarians, and Bulgaria for Bulgarians. And there they were often defined by language. India, obviously, is a much more complex example because it's a mixture of language and religion and culture and history that gets kind of certainly used by politicians to further their ends.
Is it the rise of nationalism is what we are saying?
I think the last 150 years have certainly seen the rise of nationalism. If one looks at sort of Europe at the end of the 19th century, we see the very clear emergence of specific language-based countries for whom their identity became incredibly important. And that wasn't really true before. That then spread through much of Asia and Africa. That said, there are also lots of countries which are certainly multilinguistic,
right,
and to a large degree multicultural and multi-religious.
An interesting anecdote about a person who is born in one country, grows up in another, marries in a third, works in a fourth, and then finally is a citizen of a fifth. So we've seen a lot of that, haven't we? With Europe breaking up into states, India breaking up, colonial India breaking up. It makes you think that the idea of a nationhood is also not static.
And critically, these are human inventions.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
100% agree.
And yet they're treated as if they have some real existence above and beyond humans. These are things we humans created, and we created them relatively recently. And if we don't like them, we can disinvent them.
Welcome back. We are in conversation with Sam Miller, the author of book Migrants, The Story of Us All, published by Abacus Books. The book is available on Amazon and other outlets. Sam is a prolific writer and an Indophile who has written a number of books, among which are Delhi, Adventures in a Megacity, The Blue Guide, India Through Foreign Eyes, Fathers, and others. He has worked for the BBC, and for many years he has widely travelled and lived in countries as diverse as India, Pakistan, Cambodia, Tunisia, and Ethiopia. Sam has also grown up in a home where reading and education was the norm. Both his parents are writers, top-class editors, and educationists. And his has been a career which mixes journalism and writing. So you are lucky to be listening to an exceptional personality like Sam Miller, and we are very happy to have you with us today in the studio, Sam. Now, would you like to first of all tell us a little bit about your childhood, or your upbringing? What got you into writing?
I think I was always surrounded by writing. Writing was a normal activity in my household. My father, soon after he left university, became a literary editor. Became the literary editor of magazines like The Spectator, The New Statesman, The Listener, and finally the London Review of Books. He began writing books himself in the 1970s, and I think in the 1980s became a professor of English literature. And so for me, and my mother was an English teacher and then a professor of English and again a writer of books. She's still with us.
For our listeners, Sam's late father was Carl Miller and his mother is Jane Miller. Both of his parents have had an enormous influence on your literary academic career.
I think that's absolutely right. For years, I didn't want to write books, almost as a kind of reaction to them. My dad always used to say, why don't you write about this? So when I was living in India in the 90s, I would come back with stories and I would do journalism. And journalism was what I really wanted to do. And it was only kind of sort of in my sort of middle age that I really moved towards writing. Certainly I was influenced by my parents, and my mother and now my father would read everything I wrote and comment on it and so on. So in a way I had a kind of in-house editor, which was wonderful. Yeah. So I feel very privileged in that way, and it certainly helped me write over the years.
I think it's marvellous to have that kind of a background. Now, I just go back to the book a bit, and I was looking at it, and if you ask me which was my favourite bit of the book, is actually the bit about America and slave trade, about how the white Europeans not only came across to America, but they killed off all the locals. And also, it would seem to me that that was the time when migration began to go wrong, where the concept of colour sort of was introduced. And though you have, there is a very interesting interlude where you're talking about choice, but clearly in the coming of the Africans to America, there's very little choice exhibited in that. And there is also the important matter of their entire personal stories being lost. Almost none of them had the language to write what they felt. But would you consider that an interesting part, or would you like to read a little bit from your book?
Okay, so I'm going to read a bit from the chapter in the book that deals with slavery. And it's almost the last story that I've told, because it brings slavery almost into the modern day, or American slavery into the modern day. In 1860, just before the start of the American Civil War, an ocean-going ship called the Clotilda, in good condition and only 5 years old, was set on fire by its owner. He wanted to hide the evidence of a crime he had committed, and for which, as it turned out, he would never be punished. The burnt-out shell of the Clotilda soon disappeared into the alligator-infested mud swamps of the Mobile River in the state of Alabama, not far from a place that would later become known as Africa Town. The owner of the Clotilda was a man called Timothy Meagher. He was the son of an Irish migrant who had fled his homeland to avoid conscription by the occupying British Army and settled in Maine. Meagher himself was born in Maine, but as a young man he too migrated more than 2,000 kilometers to the deep south, to what would have felt in many ways like a different country. He moved, like many other white Americans, to Alabama, a new state recently cleared of most of its Native American population, who had been driven to the west beyond the Mississippi. He went to the city of Mobile, close to the Gulf of Mexico, where he and his brother made a small fortune from cotton, timber, and steamboats, and where they became, in the words of one of their northern relatives, ardent Southerners. The Meaghers thought it most unfair that it was no longer legal to bring African slaves into the USA. Despite the abolition of the international trade in slaves, slavery itself, as an American economic and social institution, and as a lived reality for its victims, was firmly entrenched in the south of the country, and remained so until the Civil War. And there was still a large internal slave market. The big slave owners of the Old South liked this situation because it increased the value of the human beings they considered their property, while the owners of the plantations in the newer states of the Deep South resented the fact that if they wanted slave labor, and they did, they would have to buy it at inflated prices from elsewhere. And so it was that on a steamboat ride down the Mobile River, Timothy Meagher boasted to a group of friends that he knew how he could get African slaves into the country unnoticed by the authorities. According to one of these friends, he laid down a bet of $1,000. I myself can bring a ship full of slaves right into Mobile Bay under the officers' noses. It's here then, in the year before the outbreak of the Civil War, that two very different migration narratives intersect. The Minor Meagher story and the painful epic tale of the last group of enslaved Africans to be transported across the Atlantic to the USA. And for once we know more about the slaves than the slavers. In later times, journalists and writers sought out the former slaves, liberated as a result of the Civil War, the last of whom died as recently as 1940. Many of them settled in an area on the outskirts of Mobile, which they called Africa Town, and where some of their descendants still live.
Thank you, Sam. That was well read. But would you like to let our listeners know how the story actually finishes?
Certainly. So, in the book, I describe how Africa Town has been rediscovered in recent years, that they found the wreck of the ship, that lots of the children and grandchildren of those last enslaved people have been interviewed, have told their stories.
Right.
And I went back there myself a year and a half ago to see how things had changed. And in a way, now in America, slavery is marked and remembered and memorialized.
Right.
I think in the past, it was treated simply as an embarrassment. We don't talk about it. Now it is part of the central narrative
right.
of how American history is told. And Africa Town is very much part of that narrative.
Right, thanks for that. And it's very interesting to know that the ship Clotilda, the name is based on a goddess?
A saint, a Christian saint, who I think was supposed to be the patron saint of disappointing children. I always loved the idea that disappointing children
Yes, that's interesting. I'm sure many of us
need someone to look after.
yes, that is interesting. Sam, I have one more question that I cannot, deny my listeners, which is we need to come back to India when we talk about migration. I personally would not like to get into the controversial question of Aryan invasion theory versus the out of India theory. But my question is, the partition of India brought around one of the largest migrations. Some say 14 million migrated, another account says 18 million. But whatever, the numbers are certainly larger than Africans being transported to America, or even the Jewish population being displaced or hounded out of Europe. But your book doesn't talk much about the colonial partition of colonial India at all, or the migration of such a huge number of people. Is there a reason why it's been left out?
Yeah, I thought a lot about it, and in a way, there are certain subjects I chose not to do, partly because I was concerned they would almost overwhelm the book, that they're so big. I also do not talk, for instance, about, and it's an India-connected story, but so many people ask me about it, is gypsies or Roma.
Yeah, the Roma, yeah.
I don't talk about that. I think a huge amount of research has been done on these issues. There's fantastic work going on partition at the moment. I don't know if you've come across, for instance, Anchal Malhotra's work. It's very, very impressive. I'm not sure, to be honest, that I had anything particularly new to say. The only thing I would say is that one of the things that interests me, lots of little obvious ways, in the names of various sort of Lahore kebab houses in Delhi, or not Lahore kebab houses, Lahore shops, that there is a memory.
Karachi halwa, for example.
Karachi halwa, yeah,
Yes.
exactly. That even if lots of families didn't or couldn't talk about it because so many of the things were so traumatic
and pretty
terrible
recent,
that they were memorialized, and people, particularly in more recent years, have begun to talk properly about it.
From my perspective, it was a bit disappointing that you did include the African slave and then the Jews, which also, by the way, very interesting episode about Aunt Polly and her writing, actually really very interesting. But I somehow feel that, maybe it's my perspective entirely, that the book would have been enriched if you had spoken about the impact, because even today all the relations in the countries, relationships, whether it's with Bangladesh or what was West Pakistan at one time, or Pakistan, they have been coloured the last 75 years entirely. And what to speak about Pakistan, Bangladesh? They are even colouring our relations with UK, for example.
No, I think all of that's absolutely right, but I took another decision as well, and that decision was largely to end the book in the 70s.
I did, yes.
And I did that for very clear reasons. And that reason is that the arguments are so unpleasant, so toxic, and I think there's an element of this over partition, that no one listens to each other. No. They just look at a book and say, oh, which side are they on? Who are they supporting? Rather than looking at the nuance, looking at the stories that tell us. And what we need to do is stop pontificating in grand ways about these things, but think about the stories of individuals, of migrants on all sides, for instance, in that story. And my worry, and it applies to partition, is that in the past that has been lost. We've seen the emergence of very different narratives in different countries, and they're often narratives that exclude individual stories.
You have been both a journalist and a writer, and I'm recently, in fact, seeing a lot of journalists turned writers. In the terms of writing style, what do you think are the challenges? Being a journalist, you have to respond immediately, you don't have time to think. How is it that you write?
Well, I was a radio journalist, and I think there's something very interesting about people who've been radio journalists. They weigh words in certain ways. That you, for instance, when I write to this day, I mutter to myself, which is what I used to do when I would write radio dispatches. And for me, stylistically, that's a great help, because I care about how things sound as well as how they look on the page. And that's very much my journalistic background is as a radio journalist.
Right.
And that continues to influence critically everything I write.
So which is a bigger challenge? Is journalism a bigger challenge, or is it writing?
I think for me, writing is almost as natural as breathing, in the sense that when I wake up in the morning, it's what I want to do.
Right.
And it's not a struggle. I think for some people it's, I ought to do this, I ought to do that. But a lot of the writing is terrible. So my laptop is full of books or pieces or poems that no one apart from me will ever see. So the things that have been published in a way, the tip of the iceberg. Below that is a great deal. So even this morning I woke up, I had this bizarre dream, and I was writing away, and I wasn't even really awake, but I wanted to get it down before I was fully awake. So yes, in that way I feel it's very natural. But I also felt, once I'd learnt the basics, that journalism was as well, and there isn't some fundamental difference.
Right.
Obviously, a book is so much longer, but I still feel like I'm a journalist when I'm writing.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. That's a great way of looking at it. And I do get this point about writers having to discard almost, I think, 80% of what they write, or it needs a lot of rewriting and revision, which is probably not true about journalism, because you're limited by time, aren't you? You have to file a story or a radio program by a certain time. So I suppose that would be a limiting factor.
No, that's right. And just the other day, I don't do much daily journalism now, but I did do something about the current migrant crisis in the UK, and I was reminded that I could still do that 30 minutes to write 600 words that's compelling about the modern situation. And I think learning that in sort of my early mid-20s has sort of continues to be something that sort of strengthens me. I remember even then, when I joined the BBC first, there was one individual who took one of the first pieces I wrote and edited it down and turned it from an okay university essay into a good piece of broadcast journalism. And I learnt so much from just that happening. I suddenly saw, hey, there's another way of writing.
Right. Would you like to talk about any of your other books? Fathers, for example. I must admit I haven't finished it, but I have begun to read it, and I've gone through the early bits of it. And I find the writing, can I use the word tender? I mean, almost, and it's emotional. And you sort of bare your heart, which very many an author finds it very difficult, because to reveal your vulnerability to an audience who probably will not treat it with the respect that it deserves, particularly in this book. How would you respond to that?
I suppose I've always felt generally that I need to be honest about myself in the stories I tell, or at least as honest as I can be. So even in my other books, I am a character. Some people don't like that. They think, you should use the third person. You shouldn't use the word I, and so on. For me, that doesn't work. That's unnatural.
Sam, before we start talking about your book, Fathers, I'll just read a bit about what has been written about it in the back flap of the book. In early 2014, after many years of living abroad, Sam Miller returned to his childhood home in London. His father was dying. In the months after his death, Sam began to write about his father. He had been told, long ago, a family secret involving his parents and a close friend. Now, By reading his father's papers and with the help of his mother, he was able to piece together a remarkable story, the story of his book, Fathers.
With Fathers, I had a story to tell that I really wanted to tell.
Right.
And it was trying to find almost the right voice for me to do it. And it was written in the aftermath of my father dying, and I wanted to write something that was about him. And I even say in the afterword at the end that it worked for me as a kind of therapy. Other people will see a priest or go to psychoanalysis or get drunk or whatever. People respond to things differently. Bad things happening. For me, writing is my way of dealing with it. And then when I'd finished writing it, it was a question of whether it just becomes like one of those other things in my laptop that never gets published, that no one will ever see. So I remember showing it to my mother first, who plays a big role in the story, and seeing whether she'd be happy for me to...
And was she?
She was. We talked about different bits of it and whether she felt I got this right or that was fair or so on. And then I talked to other people in my family, someone who'd written a very similar book. I almost wanted to know what the response was from, yes, people can be quite kind of, oh, it's that kind of story, or they can be quite dismissive of it. And so you need to be quite thick-skinned. But in the end, it was a story I was happy to tell people. And I also think there are so many disaster stories out there. And in the end, it's a complicated, difficult story, but it's actually about people who have been good and kind and nice to each other. And there aren't enough of those kinds of stories.
It's an enormously emotional and very well written story, and I would recommend our listeners to read it if they can. But Sam, just to ensure there is more interest in it, would you like to tell the people what the story behind it is?
Well, I won't go into the full story because in a way I wrote the book almost so that I wouldn't have to talk about it. That was part of the reason. All I will say is that in the title, Fathers, there is a very strong
message,
clue. That in many ways I had more than one father, and it's an explanation of how that came about and what that meant for everyone involved. And yes, I'm sounding a bit mysterious about it, but it was a deliberate decision again that I took, that my way of delivering it, of telling this story, is going to always be my written words rather than my summarized version of the story.
Fair enough. I'm going to grant you that, because in fact one of the reviewers did say that it does turn into a detective story at some stage. So maybe you wouldn't like to take the sting away from the story. Let the people read it. But thank you for that, and thank you for your very candid words around that. Now, it's not just your parents who are writers, and not just you who's a writer, but the interesting story that you have in your book, Migrants, I come back to that, is the story of Aunt Polly and the amazing life that she had. And would you like to share with our readers the story of Aunt Polly and where she came from and where she ended?
Absolutely. Yeah. So she was my great aunt. I knew her when I was a child. She taught me to play chess. She spoke with a very strong, what was to me a Russian accent.
What was Polish, I believe, was it?
Well, no, I mean, it was Russian. Russian was really her favourite language. And she was slightly a figure of fun at family parties. My parents used to joke that she turned off her hearing aid when anyone else was speaking. And she could be rather patronising. I rather liked her, is the truth. But I knew nothing of her life until a few years ago when I began reading her autobiography, which has never been published properly. It was published by her daughter in the family.
Is it available?
So it's not available.
It's
not available, and I would love it to be available. But it's the story of a woman who is born in the first year of the 20th century,
right,
in a town called Zhytomyr, which is now in Ukraine, to a Jewish family. And she witnesses early in her life these terrible pogroms, these killings of Jews on the streets and in their houses of her hometown. And at the age of 18, she saves her family when there's an attack on her house. And she tells that story very movingly of how she convinced them not to kill the family.
Right.
She then escapes, flees, has lots of adventures, is very unusually honest about her sex life, for instance, which is very rare for people of that generation.
That generation, right.
She travels then illegally, by modern standards, by boat to Palestine, to long before Israel exists, works there, doesn't really like it, goes to Poland, from where she rescues her family and takes them back to Palestine. She then gets a scholarship. She's never been to university, and she gets a scholarship and a letter from someone introducing her to her new maths and physics teacher in Berlin, who is Einstein.
I know, fanfare.
So she then studies under Einstein and is then given a letter from Einstein sending her to Britain to work at what's the famous Cavendish Laboratory. And there's an organisation that gives scholarships to poor Jews. And that committee, one of the senior members, was my great-grandfather, who was newly widowed. And he sees this woman and falls in love with her and proposes marriage. And she doesn't accept. She says no.
Yes, exactly.
And then she meets his eldest son.
Yes.
And they get married. And
So
they basically live happily ever after. The only thing that's extraordinary beyond that is that she writes three or maybe 4 books, all in what is her 6th language.
Yes.
Here am I struggle with other languages that I've studied over the years. I couldn't begin to write a book in any of them except English. Here was someone who was writing a book in her 6th language.
She's an amazing, amazing character. And so I would also recommend to our listeners that this is another reason why you should read The Migrants, the chapter on Zionists and Aunt Polly. And there's just one more thing that I found very interesting was something that you said was that Israel, where everybody came, all the Jews from all over the world came, and it was the promised land, and we've heard of it for centuries. And then suddenly, today, you have an Israeli diaspora. So people who took all that trouble to come to Israel, learn Hebrew, which is something that Israel insists upon, and then they don't like it, and then they start to go back out into the world, which probably brings us back this whole circle.
Some of them don't like it. Some of them simply want to work somewhere else.
Yeah,
like so many people, they want to travel and not just be stuck in one place. You're right. So I met someone, a gay man who's married to a European man at the weekend, who felt it was just too hard for him as a gay man who's married to a European to live in Israel. He's a great defender of Israel, but he was saying, I can't live there because of that. But the diaspora is full of people who are sort of doing jobs in different countries.
Just exactly where everybody else does.
Just like everyone else.
Which brings us back exactly to where we started, which is that migration does seem to be at the center of the human story. And this has been put so well to us through the book Migrants, written by Sam Miller. So one other thing that comes out through a few sentences that I've scattered here and there is the enormous role that migration has played in spread of religions, like particularly in Islam and Christianity. And both these religions, being also proselytizing, have also made the effort to go across in the world and sort of make people convert to their religions. Now, and when we come to a country like India, and we have this Hinduism. Now, as I said, I don't want to get into this controversy of the people came into India or they went out of India. But the fact is that Hinduism, for some reason, has remained confined to the boundaries of India. Do you think it's the lack of the migratory spirit amongst the Indian people that Hinduism never went abroad?
I don't think there is a lack of migratory spirit. And Hinduism did go abroad. It went abroad very widely, but in pre-modern times,
right,
into Southeast Asia. Bali, as you'll know, still has a very large Hindu population.
Angkor Wat.
Absolutely. So there are lots of places. And actually, when you go back more than 1,000 years ago, the distinction between what's Hindu and what's Buddhist is actually a lot more complicated than it is now. Those identifications weren't as clear-cut as they are in modern times. But no, you had Hindu empires in Southeast Asia long before there was a European presence in Southeast Asia, for instance.
Right.
I think there has certainly been among some Hindus, probably the best known example is in Gujarat because of Gandhi, and Gandhi being told you mustn't travel across Kalabani and him doing so, and that
losing
being seen as... But in a sense, that's what interests me. It was more about losing caste
than
right. Losing religion.
No, but
it didn't make him not a Hindu.
No.
It made him
less of a... Yeah, but that's recorded in a number of cases. Even in the... probably not Nehru, but certainly somebody else who, when he came back, his mother had actually to purify him, so to speak. But it's largely caste related. I have not heard of it being religion related too much. Yeah.
No, and I think that's right. And if you think about it, there are Hindus who have been traders, who remain great travelers, lots of them traveling around.
Even as indentured labor for you.
Absolutely. So I think the notion that Indians aren't migratory is not true. I think there are certain communities which may have stressed the idea that we should remain where we are. There has always been huge migration within the boundaries of India, and anyone who's lived in India sees evidence of that all the time. But here I am growing up in Britain. There were, from a very early age, there were Indians at school.
Right.
There were Indian restaurants in quite small places. And this was the 60s, before we had the size of the Indian populations we have now.
Current situation, I think we have now emerged also as the largest diaspora. I'm told we've overtaken the Chinese, not only in population, but in also becoming the largest diaspora. But thankfully, we no longer hear this question of losing caste. When you go abroad.
But one thing historically that you could point out is that Hinduism, like Judaism, and unlike Islam and Christianity, are tied to what is now a modern country. So, in a way, where's Islam's homeland? Well, it's lots of countries. It might be Saudi Arabia, but it could be elsewhere.
I understand what you're saying, yeah.
Whereas both Judaism and Hinduism have, for most believers, a clear heartland, while these other religions don't. So you could say that there's a greater migratory spirit, at least in Christianity and Islam, than, say, in Hinduism or in Judaism. But that you can't pretend for a moment that Jews and Hindus have not been migratory.
No,
they
certainly
absolutely
not.
Have.
Certainly not. But the yearning, the Zionist feeling that you have spoken about in the book, and I have seen that a lot in India. This whole thing about the motherland, this being my motherland, this land being sacred, that kind of a feeling that you have a lot in amongst the Hindus in India. As a recent migrant to the UK, I have seen it and dealt with this entire question of the wrench of separation from what is considered, quote unquote, your homeland. And there are psychologists who say that many a migrant actually lives almost with a lot of anxiety, a feeling of loss, separation, and some have even called it everlasting grief. And so, I mean, if migration is so central, how did all those other people that we have spoken about in the book, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Babylonians, everybody just roamed from X to Z, and the Chinese, and did they carry the same kind of feeling of loss?
I think some of them did. I think it's something that's increased massively as being sedentary, being settled in one place has become more normal.
Right.
It's a social expectation. I would almost again argue the opposite, that it's often the settled and the sedentary who are more anxious. They're anxious about those outsiders coming in and taking their land and their jobs and their NHS and their this and their that. That they're the ones who are often very angry and critical of migrants. They're the ones who are in deep psychological trouble and who are in a way suffering by taking out that anger on other people.
Yeah, but England's not the only one. We have our share of fear of our neighbours too. The Bangladeshis coming in from one side, the Nepalis coming from the other side. So I think it's a worldwide thing. So it's a strangely contradictory world in which we live, where on the one side we have this migratory spirit that makes us want to go out and learn. And on the other side, we have this feeling that this is my home. I don't want you, the outsider, to come in. Anything else that you would personally like to share with our listeners? What kind of music do you like to listen, for example? Or what is the genre of books that you like? Do you read more travel books, for example?
So recently what I've been doing is reading books by friends. It's a category of its own in a writer's life, partly because I spent the last 5 or 6 years researching this book. I've been very determinedly reading nothing that isn't about
migration. Okay.
And that means a whole group of my writer friends whose books have piled up beside my bed, and I've finally now got round to reading them. Most of them are novels.
Right.
Quite a lot of them are set in the subcontinent.
Interesting. Tell us about them.
Well, the one I've just been reading, a Delhi writer called Anchal Malhotra, who's written a book which begins in Lahore before partition, and is a wonderfully evocative story of partition, and is a kind of, I think, a magnificent way of dealing with that story, almost using fiction as a way of avoiding the toxic arguments that you might otherwise have. And obviously she's not the first to write about.
What kind of music interests you?
What kind of music? Strangely enough, the music I've been listening most to in recent years is what they call Americana.
What is this? I haven't heard of it.
Americana is slightly, it's American music.
Right.
It's like country. It's a bit more folky than that.
I see.
Some of it's quite political. There's a wonderful singer called Iris Dement, who's probably my favourite singer. And people who know that world of Americana all know her and love her.
Thank you, Sam, for your insights into the amazing world of migration. You have been listening to a conversation with Sam Miller, author of Migrants, The Story of Us All. This book is available on Amazon and all other outlets. I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed talking to Sam. We would love to hear from you, and if you have any feedback or questions, please do write to us at post@cineinkpodcast.com. In our next episode of My Book, we will be back with another author and another book, because this, my friends, is a show about authors and their books. This podcast has been produced by Parvez Alam for Cine Ink. To listen to other episodes of my book, you can visit the Cine Ink website, www.cineink.com. Until we meet again, this is Loveleen Kacker. Goodbye.